2 hours later, the team arrived in the Land of Death. It had originally been a regular piece of farmland, but after the apocalypse, it had turned into a vast wilderness that was occupied by huge numbers of zombies. People who passed through often discovered that the vegetation had become completely inedible. The zombies thrived in the overgrown environment and rarely left the area. But if any passersby thought that the zombies were harmless, they quickly realized that they were mistaken. Like any other zombie, the ones in the Land of Death attacked as soon as anyone came too close. When Charles and his entourage arrived, they were surprised to see that there was already a large number of people there. Christopher was somewhat embarrassed. "There weren't this many people here yesterday," he said earnestly. "Maybe they know that this is the place I was looking for," Charles said. There were over 300 people in Charles's army, and their appearance drew the attention of the existing crowd. Whispers began to erupt in the area. A man and a woman nearby spoke together in hushed voices. "Who's that?" the man asked. "There are a lot of them," the woman replied. "Do you think they're here to destroy the zombies?" "It's possible," the man said. "I heard that this is the place Mayor Federer is looking for. There must be something really valuable here." "Wait, look at their hands," the woman said. "What?" The man squinted at the troops. "Look at the weapons they have," she urged. "They're glowing with red phosphorescence. How many people do you know that can make weapons like that?" When the crowd realized that Charles and his team were carrying their signature glowing weapons, they burst into exclamations of delight and panic. "Mayor Federer is here! It really is Mayor Federer! Let's get out of here! I don't want him to think I'm an enemy." They knew Charles and his team had once killed over 10,000 people in a single battle. Those who were aware of that fact regarded him as a ferocious and capable leader. However, they still lacked the confidence to approach him, since he was known to be famously cold-hearted. Both total strangers and people from Dawn City were afraid of him. Although the Dawnians followed him, they didn't want to face him directly if there was a chance that he would mistake them for an enemy. "There could be thousands of zombies in here," Helen said. "It'd be dangerous to attack anyone unless we're provoked." She looked at a dark mass of zombies in the distance. Even though she knew that they were out of range and therefore unlikely to attack, they were still a potential threat. The surrounding crowd ended less than half a mile away from the zombie horde. If they accidentally breached the zombies' limits, they would attract the monsters' attention. There were also some teams present who had gone to the Land of Death specifically to lure the zombies out. Those teams had already succeeded, and they managed to obtain some crystal cores, and even some mutated zombies' vertebrae. However, they had also lost several people who had either been devoured by the zombies or become unwilling members of the undead themselves. The risk and profit of zombie hunting had always been proportional. In the event that the team members worked together effectively, their risk paid off and aided their progress. Although it was risky, those who were smart about their hunts always prevailed over those who weren't. Charles used his increased perception to observe the zombies in the distance and saw a zombie hunting team near them. Unfortunately, the hunters were neither smart nor well prepared. They appeared to have attracted a level 4 zombie, and they were scared witless. The team was running back toward the crowd. Charles rolled his eyes. Surely a dozen people would be able to defeat a level 4 zombie, he thought. They're just too gutless to try. The zombie hunting team was clearly full of cowards, and they were leading the zombies right to Charles. They ran toward the core group, shouting for help, but the people in the larger crowd were unwilling to help them. No one was willing to leave the group in order to walk into a zombie attack. "Should we intervene?" Mark asked Charles. He wasn't panicked by the massive zombies in the distance, but he did look slightly annoyed by the inconvenience the hunting group had caused. Mark was the kind of person who loved fighting. When the world had moved into the new era, the environment had awakened the combat genes in his bones, and he was always itching for a battle. "Elena, you wanted some practice, didn't you?" Charles said. "Use your Terminator sword ability on them." Elena pulled out her sword without hesitation and charged toward the zombie horde. With the new power from the divine seed in her body, she was eager to fight, and she couldn't wait to release the sword energy that was coiled inside her like a spring. When the surrounding crowd saw her rushing toward the zombies, they all cried out in surprise. "Who's that? She's crazy to attack them on her own. She looks like she has a death wish. Why isn't the mayor helping her?" When the crowd saw Elena approaching the creatures on her own, they thought Charles had sent her to fight with no reinforcements. Before Elena could leave the crowd, several figures wearing black moved to intercept her. All of them appeared to be women. "You scum!" one of them shouted at Charles, fixing him with a dark glare. "Why don't you do your own dirty work?" Charles ignored her accusations. The women had clearly misunderstood the situation and thought that he was intending to use Elena as bait. They had jumped to conclusions with no idea of Elena's true strength. "You can't face those things on your own," the woman told Elena. "It's dangerous." She approached Elena and tried to prevent her from getting any closer to the zombies. "I don't know what that man told you," she said gently, "but you don't need to listen to him. It's not too late for you to turn back. Please, whatever kind of trouble you're in, we can help you." "What's this woman's problem?" Hugh asked. He felt an immediate dislike toward the woman and her team. Helen, however, understood the group's motivation. "There are a lot of splinter groups within the survival bases now," she said, "even in the ones under the military's control. I've heard that there's been a lot of bullying and coercion, particularly toward women. Some of the teams have been using women as bait to lure the zombies. I've heard about this group of women. They're a kind of organization created to protect women. They want to save them and create a safe place. I'm sure they don't mean us any harm." "That actually sounds good," Tina said, seemingly less concerned about the women's intentions after hearing about their purpose. "But someone ought to tell them that Elena doesn't need anyone to save her." "An organization to save women?" Charles said thoughtfully. He thought hard, and then he remembered that he had heard similar rumors during his previous life. In his previous life, Charles had heard about the group of warrior women. They were a powerful organization created by a particularly intimidating woman called Rose. She encouraged other women to be strong and protect themselves in a male-dominated world, and she was known to be a fearsome leader. During Charles's previous life, Rose had been an inspiration for many people and had done her best to organize a group of women who refused to tolerate abuse from men. Her organization's primary function was to save women from abusive situations and help them regain their freedom and independence. Her intentions had been noble, but she had also been somewhat misguided. In order to prevent abused women from reliving their trauma, she had insisted that her survival base remain a female-only zone at all times. She had a deep mistrust of all men and was openly hostile to any that she met, regardless of their intentions. The other problem was that Rose had the tendency to assume that women were always victims. She actively supported women who abused men or manipulated them into doing their bidding because she saw it as evening the playing field. She also went so far as to assume that any woman who aspired to marriage and child-rearing was somehow inferior to those who wanted to fight. In the end, Rose's group had fallen apart due to her own flawed views and inflexibility, and she had committed suicide later in the era. Many had thought her death had been a shame because the group had done much to advance women's power at a time when it had been easy for them to feel vulnerable and unsafe. Elena looked at the group of women warily as she pushed past them. "Thanks," she said, "but I don't need your help." The women shouted at her to stop and tried to hold her back, but she was too fast. She broke free of their grasp, and they could only gape after her as she raced toward the zombies. "Come back!" one of them shouted. The women's hearts filled with worry for Elena. They had seen too many women rush to their deaths in the same manner. They were all sick of groups that abused their power and used their influence to bully women. It was increasingly common for groups to use women and even children as bait to hunt zombies. Although most of the time the groups managed to retrieve them, the tactic was a dangerous one and often resulted in tragedy. In the warrior women's eyes, Elena was someone who ought to be pitied. They thought she had been brainwashed. The surrounding crowd looked as if they were watching a good show. They thought it was despicable that Charles, who had such a huge army behind him, would send someone to fight zombies on their own. It appeared that he had sacrificed her. "Looks like our mayor's tired of fighting his own battles," someone jeered. "He has to send one of his girlfriends to fight for him." There were similar comments and lewd suggestions about Charles and Elena's relationship. Meanwhile, Elena reached the zombies, and her actions quickly silenced the crowd. She brandished her crimson flame sword into a crescent moon. The blade cut through the air in a streak of flames, bright red and full of crackling force, as her sword energy danced around it. The closest zombie to Elena was nearly 3 feet away, but within an instant, she removed its head from its body. The kill seemed to encourage her, and she quickly swept through the zombie horde, destroying every creature in her path. Soon there was a pile of zombies on the ground, and Elena was completely uninjured. She whisked across the battlefield like an Amazon warrior, and the group of women who had tried to save her could only stare blankly at her. They all looked entirely taken aback. None of them had ever seen such a display of power. Elena took out the zombies with her sword, as easily as breathing. She took the approaching zombies out so swiftly that the surrounding crowd felt inferior. She made the task look easy, and many members of the crowd laughed at the zombie hunters who had run away from the horde. "Is this woman a monster?" someone in the crowd asked. Although the zombies in the Land of Death weren't fast movers, there were enough of them to scare most ordinary people. Only a team of paranormals was qualified enough to fight them. Even so, it would take an incredible amount of brute force to kill hundreds of zombies. The people in the crowd had heard that legendary experts existed, but not many of them had ever seen one with their own eyes. They looked at Elena with awe. The terrifying zombies seemed like little more than target practice to her. Far from being a terrifying force, the creatures could barely get close enough to threaten her. "She's amazing," someone in the crowd said. Elena was similarly impressed by the Crimson Flame sword. She had roughly understood its power before she had used it, but in practice, it was even better than she had imagined. It was a divine sword that cut through iron and flesh like mud. The useless zombie bodies offered almost no resistance to the blade. Usually, if anyone tried to deal with such a large group of zombies alone, they would quickly use up all their strength, and even a large amount of soul energy. But since Elena had managed to obtain the divine seed that contained the Terminator sword ability, she had found herself in a completely new world. It was true that the sword made child's play of cutting up zombies, but that wasn't the extent of its ability. Its sharpness meant that it could even cut the air. With a single strike, its energy obliterated everything within a 10-foot radius. She was busy enjoying her rampage when she spotted the largest zombie she'd ever seen. It was over 8 feet tall and covered in huge muscles. Its arms were thicker than an ordinary man's waist, and its mouth was bloody. It had a singular look of determination in its beady eyes, and it approached her with huge strides that shook the ground with each step. "A slaughterer!" someone cried. Everyone in the crowd was shocked. Even by the Apocalypse's standards, the Slaughterer was a vicious, fearsome creature that even level 4 paranormal struggled to deal with on their own. It could typically only be dealt with by a team of talented level 4 paranormals, and only a level 5 stood a chance of fighting the beast one-on-one. "Be careful!" one of the warrior women shouted to Elena. "You're no match for that thing on your own. Retreat!" Another woman shouted anxiously, "Get out of there! We'll cover you!" But the women looked in despair when they saw the look in Elena's eyes. It was a look of determination and fighting spirit. She didn't retreat, but instead plowed ahead in her enthusiasm to challenge the Slaughterer. She cut down the smaller zombies in her way and held her sword out, ready to take on the huge beasts. "I can't look," one of the women said, hiding her face in her hands. They had initially thought Elena had needed rescuing, but they quickly realized that she was an unstoppable force. They knew that if they could persuade her to join them, she would be a tremendous asset to their survival base. But even having seen her previous display, they knew that it was almost impossible for her to defeat the huge monster by herself, and they watched in horror as she rushed to her doom. The Slaughterer caught Elena with an open palm. All of the people in the crowd who had faced one of the monsters before flinched. The Slaughterer's power was well known. The paranormals who had fought with one before all knew one fundamental rule: never engage it in close combat. They shouted as much to Elena from the sidelines. They all knew that unless several level 4 paranormals helped her, it was impossible for her to win. When Elena got back to her feet after taking the hit, everyone began to fear the worst for her safety. "Are you still not going to help her?" Helen asked Charles nervously. Even though he wants to train her, he couldn't possibly want her to face something so terrifying, could he? She wondered. "No," Charles replied simply. "She can handle it." Helen wanted to tell him to intervene. When she saw his calm, confident eyes, she settled for looking angry and didn't press the matter further. "You can't expect her to fight the thing alone." one of the warrior women said furiously. The women were more annoyed at Charles and his team than ever. He clearly had a huge army, but he was happy to stand back and let Elena fight alone. He seemed completely insane. The slaughterer lurched forward to deal Elena another hard blow, and many of the spectators had to cover their eyes. Despite their concerns, most of them still peeped through their fingers to see what was happening. "I'm not going to assume she needs me until she says so," Charles said firmly. "She's more than capable." As the slaughterer''s huge fist flew out toward Elena again, she quickly squatted and dodged the attack. Then, she used the power in her legs to propel herself upward with a terrific force. The Crimson Flame's sword drew several arcs in the air. Everyone watched in amazement as the weapon met the slaughterer''s huge hand. The monster let out a loud cry as its hand was incapacitated, and Elena took advantage of the distraction. She swiped at the zombie furiously and landed several strong blows all over its huge body. Because it was large and slow, she had the advantage of speed. As it swatted at her with its remaining hand, she moved nimbly and targeted other areas until it finally fell to the ground in submission. "That woman isn't human," someone exclaimed. The surrounding crowd was stunned. It was the first time they had encountered anyone who had successfully defeated a slaughterer in close combat. Although it appeared that the creature had surrendered, it tried half-heartedly to attack Elena from the ground. But she had known better than to assume the creature was no longer a threat. It had taken the first opportunity to move behind the monster, out of harm's way. "I have to say, Charles," she shouted, "I am loving this Terminator sword ability." She loved the rush of adrenaline she experienced when she wielded the Terminator sword ability. She felt like she was untouchable. The sword seemed to be able to cut through everything. She knew that even level 4 paranormal struggled to fight against a slaughterer. The creature's defense was too strong. She knew that just the mention of the 8-foot zombie was enough to make countless paranormal shiver in fear. However, with the combination of the Crimson Flame sword and the Terminator sword ability's energy, the slaughterer had been reduced to a slightly stronger version of a regular zombie. Elena wasn't the kind of person who enjoyed an easy fight. She liked to face enemies that challenged her and made her feel as though she had worked for her victory. The slaughterer had been a worthy adversary, and she had enjoyed the fight immensely. But though she had enjoyed the battle, she wasn't inhumane. She finished the creature as cleanly as possible, and then she recalled Charles's lessons. He had told her that the best way to confirm death was to retrieve the crystal core from its body. The crystal core was the crystallization of the zombie's energy. Without it, the creature lost the source of all its strength. Retrieving the crystal was generally accepted as the best way to confirm the death of any creature other than a bug. Elena moved swiftly and retrieved the crystal core. She put it carefully into a small bag. The onlookers were impressed by her work. Some of them even found that they had been holding their breaths. They began to praise her. "Who is that woman?" "Didn't you tell her not to try close combat with it?" someone joked to their friend. "Good thing she didn't listen to your battle plan. I can't believe how fearless she is." Elena's incredible triumph over the entire zombie horde and the massive slaughterer had left a strong impression on all of them. She had defeated the monster so easily that they were simultaneously impressed and terrified. The team of women looked sheepish. "I can't believe we wanted to save her," one of them said quietly to her friend. "I'm glad we didn't rush over there," her friend agreed. "It's more than likely she'd have ended up saving us." They felt guilty for assuming that Elena had been a damsel in distress. It was evident now that she had thoroughly enjoyed the fight. They all promised themselves that they would remember the battle in the future and be more careful to ensure that a woman was in genuine danger before they intervened. The leader of the small group's eyes lit up. "How amazing would it be if she joined us?" she exclaimed. "Yes," her friend agreed. "She would be amazing. I'm sure she'd do well in the group." "She definitely seems like the type who'd enjoy our group," another said. "I'm sure she'd appreciate what we're trying to do." The other onlookers were still standing frozen in shock. Even the other Daunians had been suitably impressed by her. Hugh was pleased for her, but he couldn't help feeling slightly outdone. "I wonder if I could ever have that kind of power," he thought. It was a common experience for warriors to compare themselves to their peers. Hugh was a good fighter in his own right, and he had already achieved a significant amount of power. But when he saw that Elena had achieved a level that surpassed his own, Instead of being happy for her, he couldn't help but feel the familiar pang of envy. He no longer had any hope of approaching Charles's level, but he had followed him for as long as Elena, and he had also enjoyed the same benefits as her. He wanted to surpass her level. Charles saw the glint of ambition in Hugh's eyes. "Don't worry," Charles said. "You're already functioning at the upper limit of what your body can tolerate. The reason I haven't given you more strength is because your combat awareness and physical fitness can't keep up with it. As long as you're willing to train yourself more, you'll eventually be able to withstand more." That thought pleased Hugh immensely. The other paranormals and warriors around him also seemed optimistic that they might one day have strength that rivaled Elena's. They realized that Elena's strength was due to her own hard work and diligence, but it had also somehow been given to her by Charles. They wondered if he would grant them similar powers if they were willing to follow him and kill his enemies. Before Charles could say anything else, he felt that something was wrong. "Tina, Mark, over there," Charles shouted. He rushed into action faster than anything Tina had ever seen. Within seconds, he was already several yards away. He moved toward Elena like an arrow that had been released from a bow. "Get ready," he shouted. Tina was shocked, but she rushed forward with Hugh and the other two. The change in Charles was like night and day. When Elena had faced the slaughterer, he looked calm and collected. Now he was moving so quickly that he couldn't even give specific instructions. He simply offered one-word commands as he prepared for some unknown ordeal. They all wondered what had triggered the change. As was common under Charles's leadership, there was no time to think. They prepared for an attack without question. Although Mark was strong, his speed was clearly his weakness. He found himself lagging behind the others. "What should we do?" a paranormal asked the others. They all exchanged nervous looks. Charles had absolute power in Dawn City, and they didn't dare to act without his permission, but none of them had been given any instructions. "Let's support him from back here," one of them suggested. "We all know how strong the mayor is. If we don't wait for his instructions, we'll only get in the way of whatever he's planning. We should use long-range attacks on whatever comes toward us. The warriors should form a defensive circle, and the paranormals will support from the middle and attack whatever comes toward Mayor Federer from the sides." They all knew that Charles was inhumanly fast. If they attacked the same target as him, they would likely get in the way. But if they took out enemies on either side of him, they would help to ensure that he could focus on the primary target. The group thought that it was possible they could stop any nearby zombies from approaching Charles and his team. It was a brilliant tactic, because it meant that they wouldn't get in their way. "I feel great," Elena declared. She felt power coursing through her body. At that moment, she felt like a goddess of war. No matter what kind of enemy she was faced with, she knew she could tear it apart. She kept waving out sword energy from her hands. When it met the zombies, it destroyed them instantaneously. The area within 10 feet of her became a danger zone. "Elena, come back!" Charles's stern shout rang across the battlefield. Come back, she thought. Why would I retreat? She was immersed in killing. She felt that she still had a lot of strength left, and she was spurred on by her conquests. She didn't see any reason for her to run away. She cleared away a large group of zombies and suddenly had a clear view of a new threat. A knight wearing black armor and riding a black horse was charging at her. The metal sword in its hand reflected the light cruelly, and the sea of zombies parted and ran away. What is this? She wondered. Is it a special zombie? She felt in her bones that the knight was a strong threat. If nothing else, the fact that it could scare away so many zombies with such ease proved that its power was extraordinary. Despite the danger, Elena felt that she could fight. The knight in black armor rushed at her. Its incredible speed forced her to dodge. Just as the knight's sword was about to hit her, she jumped up and rolled in the air. Then she swung the crimson flame sword at the knight. She had intended to decapitate the threat, but it was too fast, and she had limited mobility midair. The Terminator's sword ability's energy exploded as it slashed at the knight's body with its destructive force. She felt a sinking feeling in her stomach when she realized that her invincible sword energy had only left a faint mark on the new creature's armor. The black-armored knight had exerted enough force to deflect the attack, that it launched its heavy sword at Elena. She felt a powerful pressure on her chest, and she landed spread-eagled on the battlefield. Impossible, she thought. Finally, the feeling of invincibility that the Terminator's sword ability had provided wore off. She remembered that she was a mortal being and was fallible to stronger enemies. But it seemed that the price of that knowledge was going to be her own life. She tried to stand up, but the Black Knight was faster. Its steed had rushed past her after the initial blow, but now it wheeled around and charged back at her as fast as it could. Its vicious master raised its sword and prepared to deal Elena the final death blow. "I'm going to die," she realized. When she saw the knight approaching with its cruel weapon raised high, her heart filled with despair. She wanted to move, but her entire body was already injured from taking the first hit. She closed her eyes and thought of her daughter. The surrounding crowd also thought she was done for, but they were too afraid to help against such a powerful adversary. They had seen her performance against the zombies and knew that she was a great warrior. They all knew that if she couldn't win against the knight, there wasn't a person among them who stood a chance. They thought it was a shame that someone so capable was about to die, and their hearts went out to her, but they knew there was nothing they could do. The knight's sword stopped an inch from Elena's forehead. It was close enough for her to feel the energy from its tip radiating above her head. She opened her eyes and saw a tall figure looming above her. The knight had dismounted from its steed and seemed to be frozen in place, unable to fulfill its terrible intention. Charles approached them. "Another knight," he marveled. "I didn't expect to see one of these here." Charles moved the knight's sword away from Elena's head. The Nether Knights were said to be an elite group of fighters. They had great power, and the Lord of the Underworld used them to maintain order. Charles had never heard of them being commanded to attack people outside of the Underworld. "I can't always rely on the knowledge I have from my previous life," he reminded himself. "It's just there as a frame of reference." He knew that the knight's appearance in the real world was linked to some kind of conspiracy. His intuition told him that there must be a link between his rebirth and the knight's sudden appearance outside the Underworld. His new life had created a kind of butterfly effect on things around him, and things didn't always happen as they had before. He put his concerns behind him because he knew the most important thing at the moment was to deal with the knight and check on Elena. Charles gripped the knight's sword tightly and turned the blade on its owner. Then, with his right hand pointing like a sword, he slashed at the knight's arm and severed the limb entirely. He claimed the sword as his own. Amid the crowd, the women from Rosa's warrior group looked completely stunned. The group of women had never relied on men to protect them, and Rosa had always made it clear that men were not welcome in their group. But when one of the women saw the way Charles had literally disarmed the knight for Elena, she suddenly realized that there were still good men in the world. Their group had always regarded men as a hindrance to their cause, and often as bullies. They felt that women should be independent and not rely on men to protect them. But they did have to admit that Charles was a worthy fighter who made people feel at ease on the battlefield. "Thank you," Elena said to Charles with difficulty. The Nether Knight didn't spend time mourning the loss of its arm. It reached its left hand to its waist and pulled out a short sword. Not far away, the zombie group had separated again. Two more Black Knights rushed toward Charles, their swords flashing with a cold gleam. Surely he can't win against three of them, the people in the crowd thought. They all looked at Charles apprehensively, wondering what his next move would be, and silently hoping that he would beat the odds. Damn it, how many of these things are there? Charles wondered. The one-armed knight attacked him, but the other two focused their attention on Elena. She had managed to struggle to her feet and had adopted a defensive stance, but her injuries were severe. Both she and Charles knew that she couldn't move or fight with anything like her usual intensity. Charles could rely on his speed to dodge the monsters, but Elena didn't have that luxury. Before I had the preservation ability, this kind of situation might have been difficult. But this'll be a piece of cake now, Charles bragged, wanting to keep her spirits up. He held the knight's sword tightly, waving it in a circular motion, and deflecting the attacks from all three knights. The lightning cadaver serpent emerged from the tattoo on Charles's arm. It opened its mouth and ejected a ball of flickering blue lightning that landed on the one-armed Nether Knight. The serpent opened its mouth and swallowed the knight whole. Charles was also in battle mode. He blocked an initial attack from the second knight using the sword he had taken from its predecessor. Then he dodged a deadly blow and caught the knight square in the chest before it had time to stabilize itself. When he had pierced the knight's armor, he summoned a gleaming fire python. "Fire Snake, true fire version," he declared. Once a paranormal reached level 5, it was paramount that they received a long period of varied training to continue improving. One method to increase their strength was to utilize their fire-type abilities. Some people could only use ordinary flames, but others could use true fire for abilities such as the Fire Snake. Due to Charles's experience using the Extract Amulet, he was already familiar with true fire. On top of that, the Preservation ability allowed him to have better control of his soul energy. Even if he used true fire to cast an advanced technique, it wouldn't take up too much energy. The Fire Snake danced through the air, and within seconds, the injured Nether Knight's entire body ignited in flames. A few minutes later, the monster was burned to ashes. Even a powerful Nether Knight was unable to resist the power of true fire. Charles used the time to his advantage and summoned another dragon. This one was made of ice. He sent it whistling toward the remaining Nether Knight. The knight waved its sword threateningly at the ice dragon, but before a victor could be determined, Charles had already appeared beside the knight. He moved his arm like a sword, and an invisible sword energy radiated from his body. Charles moved fluidly and made short work of the monster. The Nether Knight's body had frozen before Charles had time to turn around and witness his victory. Charles admired the sword he had taken from the first knight. He turned it over several times, took a few practice swings. "This is actually a very nice sword," he commented. Now that he had time to examine it, he could see that the weapon had been forged from unholy cold iron. It was incomparably sharp. Charles had previously given away one of his favorite swords, one forged from the Hive Queen's teeth. He had parted with it because someone else had needed it more than him, and he had discovered that the sword had been too short to be useful to him. His innate sword energy was now sharper than the Hive Queen blade, so he hadn't seen any point in retaining the weapon other than for sentimental reasons. And Charles wasn't a sentimental person. He took a great deal of satisfaction in giving away things that he no longer needed, and in seeing others reap the rewards of their hard work using tools he had crafted. He knew that the Nether Knight's sword was far superior to the Hive Queen blade. He decided to put the new sword to the test by using it on the remaining zombies. With the new blade in hand, he began his massacre of the vile creatures. The zombies had held back in the presence of the superior Nether Knights, and they hadn't interfered with the battle. But now that the deterrents had been eliminated, the zombies returned in droves. None of them were a match for Charles and his new sword, and he cut them down like dandelions. Charles was also more agile than the monsters, and he evaded their attacks with ease. The crowd shook their heads in admiration. They had thought they had seen everything on the battlefield that day, but seeing Charles work against such a large horde on his own was a masterclass in zombie hunting. Several of them exclaimed their admiration for him, and others cheered him on in support. Even Rose's warrior team was undeniably impressed. They hated to admit it, but he was definitely the most skilled fighter they had ever seen. Tommy, Tina, and Hugh rushed to Charles's side. They had been learning combat techniques from him personally, and now that they both possessed blood-refining divine weapons that Charles had forged for them, their strength had improved tremendously. Even if they solely relied on their weapons in a fight, they knew they could deal with most of their enemies without using up their own personal energy. Mark went to work using his giant axe and slashed one zombie after another. Unfortunately, his pace didn't match his strength, and though his hits were fatal, he worked at half the speed of Charles's 3 followers. Once Charles's reinforcements arrived, Charles had time to catch his breath. He observed with approval as his 3 followers formed a protective triangular formation around him. He drew up a rejuvenation amulet and placed it on Elena's body. With the additional charge of power, her injuries healed quickly. "Thank you for saving me," Elena said gratefully, looking at him. But beneath her gratitude, she felt the writhing coils of guilt. She knew that she had displayed signs of energy deviation. "It's perfectly normal for you to feel supercharged and invincible when you've achieved such a powerful amount of strength," he said. "But I hope you've learned for next time that it's important to know your limits." Charles had experienced energy deviations in his previous life. At that time, he had wanted power at all costs, but on the way to obtaining it, he had lost much that had been precious to him. He had thought that he could have everything he wanted if he had power, but in the end, he had lost everything in its pursuit. All that had been left was hatred. "I wish I'd known then what I now know of life," he thought. "Strength is what's needed to have power, and without a strong heart and mind, I wasn't able to control my power. I was a slave to it, and look where that got me. that was angry, miserable, and full of hatred. He started to think about others he had known, unscrupulous people who would do anything to survive. Those sad, misguided people, he thought with a sigh. They thought that as long as they survived, that was enough. And they suffered energy deviations too. No matter who or what they sacrificed, all they cared about was their own survival. But of course, the more they lost, the worse their chances of survival became. Charles wasn't usually prone to philosophizing, but his thoughts kept intruding. He turned to Elena and said, "People can only really understand how to live fully if they've experienced true life, death, and suffering. But there's no point in me preaching to anyone. That won't enlighten them. Actions speak louder than words to most people, so I have to show them the way to live. They don't need to understand. They just need to live fully and work out what their priorities are." Elena nodded in agreement. The most important thing to her was Jenny, and she was willing to do absolutely anything it took to protect her. She worried about who would protect Jenny if she died. Elena had often thought about how her daughter would survive if she fell into enemy hands, and she had decided that she would rather kill her daughter herself than see her face a fate worse than death. She would do all she could to stop that from happening. "I know you want power," said Charles. "I understand your desire to look after Jenny, but don't forget that the true value of power lies in being able to use it to protect those you love and care about. People who forget that do so at their peril. So make sure you control your power. Don't let it control you." "I understand," she said, nodding again. She knew that what Charles said was true, but she also knew that if she died, there would be no one left to protect her daughter, and she was unwilling to entrust her child's life to the unknown. At that moment, she felt the divine seed's energy calm down inside her. She wasn't sure why, but she knew the change in energy was a good development. "Enough of this," she said, brandishing her crimson flame sword. "We have work to do." Charles shouted an order to the soldiers. "Everyone to the battlefield. I want these zombies dealt with." The soldiers began to slaughter the zombies. Charles had already killed the most powerful zombies, and Tina, Elena, and the others had finished off the level 3 zombies. The rank-and-file infantry should easily be able to kill the rest, thought Charles. People watching the battle were astonished that such a small number of fighters had been able to slaughter so many high-level zombies. A massacre had taken place before their very eyes. One soldier said, "It's like in one of those historical novels where the generals and the spellcasters fight one-on-one, leading the battle formation, and then still are capable of more one-on-one fighting in the next battle." "You're right," said another. "It's the same in the books I've read. The generals' individual combat skills are always heavily exaggerated. I didn't know they could be this strong in the real world, too." It was well known that in real-world combat, the most important things to have were strong leaders, who were good tacticians, and strong soldiers. In fiction, if a general won a one-on-one fight, his soldiers would all swarm around him to protect him. But that seemed impossible in the real world. Yet that very thing had happened in front of these soldiers' eyes at that moment. Charles had dealt with all the most powerful zombies and the Nether Knights, and the remaining zombies were like lambs led to the slaughter. An Earth-type paranormal raised a defensive wall of rocks, and the zombies could only push their hands through the small gaps in it, while the Daunian warriors stabbed at them through those same gaps. The Ice-type and Fire-type paranormals also threw down lines of defense with their powers, so the pressure on the soldiers lessened, and the number of casualties they took reduced greatly. Watching what was happening on the battlefield, the crowd of onlookers realized how effective it was when the Daunian troops and the paranormals fought together against the zombies. Someone said, "Look how well they're using their superpowers. They're so much more effective when they all work together." Another replied, "Battle strategy is such an important aspect of war. We should think seriously about how we use our superpowers." Charles was also pleased with the outcome. No wonder Olivia insisted that the paranormal should follow us into battle, he thought. That was a very effective tactic, even if she was showing off how well she's trained her paranormals. The Daunians' way of fighting using ordinary warriors and paranormals side by side might have seemed strange to some people, but Charles knew it could really help their cause. As word of this battle spread in the future, other paranormals would come to value the role of warriors, and they would want to be comrades who could help each other, not be on opposing sides. Charles pondered further how Olivia had brought about a great new fighting partnership. In the past, a lot of paranormals were betrayed by ordinary people who were trying to protect themselves, he thought. Some of the paranormals bullied the ordinary folks too, and once the ordinary people became warriors, their conflict intensified. But Olivia has made them see that though they might be different types of people, they share a common enemy. So now we can all fight together and be so much more effective. Charles watched the Earth-type paranormals as they enlarged the wall, and then he looked on as the Fire-type paranormals burned all the dead bodies. Water-type paranormals then put out the flames and picked up the zombie spines, crystal cores, and everything else that couldn't be burned. He was very impressed with their teamwork and Olivia's organizational skills. With the creation of the Dawn Alliance and the survival base, he wanted to build somewhere for the people around him to live in safety and to create a powerful force with them as his supporters. But unknowingly, he also had a major positive impact on the world and the way the people within it saw each other. Perhaps I'm only able to influence this region at the moment, he thought, but soon my power will grow and reach many other places, and the world will be a better place like it used to be. Charles laughed at himself, thinking, when did I become so sentimental and nostalgic, pining for the old world? Putting away his weapons, he knew he had already dealt with a powerful enemy. If another high-level zombie appeared, he would deal with that too, and the rest would be left for his troops to practice their skills on. The battle had lasted for 4 hours, and many of the soldiers were so exhausted that they collapsed to the ground. After such an intense fight, mental energy could be recovered quite quickly, but not so with physical exhaustion. They just had enough energy left to put away their weapons. Others collected up zombie vertebrae to be used as daggers, and because the paranormals had acquired a surplus of energy from the crystal cores they had gathered, they killed more and more zombies to harvest useful parts from. In the last hour or so of the battle, many spectators had joined in the fighting. It had taken some time to pluck up the courage to fight, because they could see that there were so many zombies. But once Charles had killed the most powerful ones, the spectators felt brave enough to join the battle. Despite not being regular soldiers, they followed the example of the Daunian warriors and fought in the same organized way. People can be very tenacious, Charles thought. So many of us have faced countless dangers and desperate situations recently, and these ordinary people with no proper training excelled when put to the test. Now that they know they can help to defend themselves, they'll have more hope, and a glimmer of hope is all it'll take to strengthen their resolve. They may not be in peak physical condition, but they've already learned the benefits of fighting as a united force. Or maybe they activated their inbuilt sense of communal responsibility instead. Charles wanted to become as strong as possible, but he knew that he couldn't ask that of everyone else. Everyone was different, and he could respect that. While some were destined to be great leaders, others would always be followers. But if ordinary people understood the benefits of cooperation and acting in the interest of the whole community, things would improve. Watching everyone cooperating to achieve such a successful outcome had touched Charles, and it was rare for him to feel moved by anything. If we're united, we're so much stronger and a greater force for good in the world, he thought. We'll survive this terrible apocalypse together. He had heard lots of calls for unity over the years, and though many had succeeded, countless attempts had failed. Unity is often only temporary, he thought. It's hope that's vital if a unified community is to thrive. It's easy for a strong man like me to think I can survive without help, but what about people who need help? If I want the people I care about to live longer, better lives, perhaps I need to do more to make that happen. He looked at his fighting troops and the paranormals who were harvesting crystal cores from the zombies and felt an unusual sense of relief. If I can't make this sort of cooperation happen more often, if I can't help my people to live a better life, then what use is all this power? He thought. I can do more, and I will. I know what it means to make sacrifices for the greater good, and I'm not afraid of hard work, so I'll make it my mission in life to fill the world with light and hope. At the end of the battle, Charles summoned the lightning cadaver serpent to him and put the phantasm stone into its mouth. This is the phantasm stone, he said. It'll enhance your death attribute, and as this is the land of death with the richest underworld energy, it's the best place for you to break through. He had high hopes for the lightning cadaver serpent. In the future, these creatures would be known as one of the 10 beasts of the apocalypse, and whenever one appeared, there would be a natural disaster, terrifying the people there. Lightning cadaver serpents were to become the source of many such disasters by exerting their power on humans, beasts, and zombies alike, and they would cast an indelible shadow of death wherever they were found. Charles knew that they didn't hunt in packs, and as long as one had eaten well, it wouldn't cause great harm. But when the serpent's belly wasn't full, it was a different matter entirely, and the hungry serpent would be a powerful asset by his side in battle. After the lightning cadaver serpent had swallowed the phantasm stone, the black aura of death began to surge around its body, and devilish purple markings appeared on its skin. Then a powerful aura erupted from it, making it roll around in agony on the ground. Charles looked on unconcerned, knowing this was the only way for the creature to reach level 5. I want it to be an exceptional weapon in battle, not a cuddly pet, he thought. It has to pass this test and break through, or it won't be of any use to me at all. Explaining to his senior deputies what was happening, Charles said, "In some worlds, level 5 is called the Transformation Realm. Some people think that's because you can transform the shape of your energy once you reach it, but that's only one part of it. It's really called this because only by reaching this state will it be possible to break through and transform into something new." He then fed the lightning cadaver serpent several essence amulets to help it complete its final transformation. Blue lightning began to appear all over the serpent's body, gradually changing to purple and continuing to flash all around it. At the same time, the air immediately around the serpent turned black and gave off a repulsive odor, making Charles's deputies nearby draw back in horror. "Look," said Charles. "Can you see all the death auras gathering around its body?" Meanwhile, a blanket of dark clouds rolled across the sky. "The dark clouds are all part of the breakthrough of the lightning cadaver serpent," explained Charles to his team. "You don't need to worry about them, just be aware of them. The state that the serpent has reached is crucial. It can even affect the limits of its future growth, so you need to pay close attention to what I'm telling you." His team nodded, and the crowd of onlookers also started to listen carefully. It was clear that he knew what he was talking about. "Intelligent life forms don't need to rush to be successful," he said. "The most important thing is to use your own wisdom, intellect, and powers of discovery to uncover the mysteries of the transformation realm. There's a huge amount of literature out there about this realm, but rather than try to read it all and weigh yourself down with it, use your initiative and learn that way." He looked around the crowd as he continued to explain. "The lightning cadaver serpent isn't an intelligent life form," he said. "Instead of intelligence, it has many of the characteristics of demons, zombies, and other monsters. Even though the peak of evolution for humans is to reach the highest possible level of intelligence, that's not the case for all life forms. Take the dinosaurs, for instance." "Yes," interrupted Hugh, wanting to show off his knowledge in front of the others. "They dominated the Earth for well over 150 million years, and their brains were only the size of a tennis ball." "That's right," said Charles, glaring at him. "Thank you, Hugh." He cleared his throat and then he continued. "Dinosaurs ruled the planet without relying on intelligence. Meanwhile, humans capable of making tools and art and having unrivaled intelligence have been on the Earth for only 200,000 or 300,000 years, and yet we've dominated the planet for most of that time. So why is the lightning cadaver serpent so terrifying if it's not an intelligent life form?" asked one of the others. Charles replied, "It might not be intelligent, but it has innate battle wisdom, and that's what's important to us." "Those strange dark clouds are looking very threatening," said Hugh. Charles looked up and said, "Keep an eye on the sky and evacuate this area. I want a cordon of about a mile setting up. Get everyone behind it." Hugh asked, "But what if people don't want to leave? We can't really force them to evacuate." "It's up to them," replied Charles. "Tell them the risks, but if they insist on staying put, that's their choice." As Hugh and the others relayed the message, some of the people started asking the evacuation team what gave Charles the right to tell them to leave. Was he so high and mighty that he could just tell ordinary people what to do and expect them to obey him? Charles understood why they might be suspicious of his motives. "They must be wondering if I'm just doing this to make myself feel good about caring for them," he thought. "It's like that time I took Lena to visit the nursing home. The people there just assumed she was satisfying her need to be charitable and kind. They didn't seem to understand that someone can be motivated by a desire to help." Listening to reports from Hugh and the rest of the evacuation team of complaints and grumbles of his high-handedness in ordering people around, Charles just dismissed their criticism, saying to Hugh, "We've already saved them from the zombies. Now they're moaning that we're trying to keep them safe from the coming danger. What is it with these people?" But in the end, the evacuation went smoothly. Most of the people left for the relative safety of the 1-mile cordon, with several stopping along the way to plunder the zombies as corpses for anything valuable that they could find. Some stayed behind, but most left, though they were reluctant to go. After the evacuation had been completed, the demonic aura around the lightning cadaver serpent's body became even more dense. A bright white bolt of lightning suddenly flashed down from the sky and landed on the lightning cadaver serpent. It twitched, but it seemed to absorb the lightning strike with no ill effects. A second bolt, and then a third flashed and hit the serpent's body, and an uproar broke out in the onlookers. One of them asked, "Are we about to watch Mayor Federer die?" "No wonder he ordered the evacuation," said another. "He didn't want anyone to see his downfall." Gossip spread quickly around the area, with people being pleased to have something different and exciting to watch. They didn't understand what was happening. Charles ignored the people who were spreading rumors. They hadn't had the sense to head for the safety cordon, so he certainly wasn't going to worry about their opinion. He redirected his attention to the lightning cadaver serpent. Apart from its inherent traits as a serpent, the creature possessed the lightning attribute. In order for its lightning attribute to remain strong, it needed to attract and absorb more lightning. The land of death had become thick with the aura of death, and there was a unique advantage to transforming and breaking through there. Even though the aura of death was very powerful, the lightning attribute could overcome it so long as it was strong enough, which was why the lightning cadaver serpent had started to strengthen its lightning power. Additionally, when the serpent broke through to the transformation realm, it would integrate its own energy with the energy of heaven and earth during the process, infusing it with a new level of power. The thunder that echoed around everyone wasn't natural thunder. It was coming from the serpent's own energy. As more and more lightning flashed across the sky and hit the lightning cadaver serpent, it quickly became badly lacerated. The onlookers couldn't bear to watch it suffering, but they didn't try to protect it, no matter how sympathetic they felt. Helen came to Charles's side and asked, "Do you want us to treat the serpent? Look at the poor thing. Its injuries are dreadful." She wasn't worried about approaching such a dangerous beast, because she knew that Charles would help her and keep her safe. But Charles shook his head and replied, "No. Most of the healing methods are useless against this sort of lightning strike. Your healing methods are wood-based, so they definitely wouldn't work. But the lightning cadaver serpent has a very strong life force, so as long as it's not completely dead, it'll regenerate itself." Charles sighed and thought. There are no perfect creatures in this world, and certainly no perfect people. He knew that the lightning cadaver serpent was among the top 10 most ferocious beasts of the post-apocalyptic era, and in some circumstances, it was close to being invincible in a one-on-one fight. "I do wish that we had a means of healing the poor creature," he thought. "It suffered terribly, and all it can do to recover is rely on its own energy. It needs food to build up its strength, too. If it survives, it'll fly high and be such a great asset to me. But if not, then let it rest in peace." Lightning continued to strike the lightning cadaver serpent for several more minutes, countless strikes hitting one after another. At the start of the process, the serpent had twitched non-stop, and its aura had grown increasingly dense. But as more lightning hit it, its aura began to decline gradually. When it seemed to be nearing its end, the lightning cadaver serpent's entire body was charred black, and the purple markings on its body gradually became less distinct. As its aura faded, the strange dark clouds in the sky began to disperse. "Is it dead? Did the process fail?" asked Tommy, looking at the lightning cadaver serpent's lifeless body. He felt a deep sense of sadness, because when he had first joined the Dawn Alliance and had signed up to follow Charles, the serpent had saved him. Although it was just a beast, he still felt very grateful to it. If I had made the decision to follow Charles back then, I wonder where I'd be now, he thought. Would I even still be alive? Hugh couldn't bear the sight of the lightning cadaver serpent's lifeless and badly burned body either. "Please," he said to Charles, "please go and fetch the poor thing's body." Charles nodded and walked slowly over to the serpent's body. He could sense the symbol on his body marking the contract that he shared with the serpent starting to fade, and he knew that when it disappeared entirely, the lightning cadaver serpent would also disappear from this world. It was supposed to be my trump card, he thought. I never thought it would die like this. Even though he had always known its death was a possibility, Charles still felt sad at the sight of the wretched creature. He was one of the toughest people around, but he still had some feelings. And the creature, like many others, had been his ally since the early days. As Charles drew close to the lightning cadaver serpent, he noticed some strange bulges protruding from its abdomen, as if something was trying to break out of his body. He could also sense that a very faint aura was brewing within the serpent's body. Although this aura was pure, Charles could tell that it was gradually drying up. The transformation didn't actually fail. he thought. It's just that the injuries it suffered are too severe for its transformation to be completed. Even though it had a powerful life force already, it doesn't have enough energy to both heal itself and complete its transformation. It needs more energy to finish transforming and ascend to a new level. He placed his hand on the lightning cadaver serpent's head and sent a special form of soul energy rushing into its ailing body through the remaining power of their contract. This energy contained the laws of life and death within it, the ancient wisdom that Charles had started to acquire. His knowledge of the laws of life and death wasn't yet very deep, because although he had opened the gate of life and death, he hadn't been able to spend much time studying and absorbing the laws. Now I need to inscribe the laws onto my soul energy, and then they'll flow into the lightning cadaver serpent, he thought. As he poured the power of the laws into the serpent, he could sense its life force beginning to revive, gradually forming a cycle. During the process of transferring the laws of life and death into the creature, Charles gained some new understanding of them. There is life and there is death, and both have meaning, he thought. Life and death have always been inseparable. They are in opposition to each other, but they also coexist. As this realization dawned on him, two contrasting but complementary symbols appeared in his hands. They must symbolize life and death. Perhaps my Sword of Death's performance will improve now. The Sword of Death was the product of the highest level of understanding of the laws of life and death that Charles had reached in his previous life. He could have continued strengthening his Sword of Death, but now that he had gained a greater understanding of the law of life, he immediately set off along a new life path. If only the law of life and the law of death were as simple as 1 + 1 = 2, he thought. But it's more complicated than that. When the laws of life and death complement each other, you know you're on the right path. And when they combine just right, they both become stronger. Once Charles had fully understood what the laws meant, he turned the lightning cadaver serpent into a tattoo on his arm, allowing the now stabilized serpent to rest and recuperate. He walked back to rejoin his team, and Helen patted his shoulder and said, "My condolences." She thought that the lightning cadaver serpent was dead. Although she didn't fully understand its significance to everyone, seeing how sad Tina and the others were, she realized that the serpent had meant something special to them. Charles smiled at her, but didn't explain anything further. After so long fighting in the apocalypse, he had learned to keep his cards close to his chest. That way he was safer, and could keep everyone else safe too. Since they all already think the lightning cadaver serpent is dead, they can keep on thinking that, he thought. Hugh and the others assumed Charles felt that he had lost a friend, and they didn't know how best to comfort him, so they could only remain silent, hoping he could sense their sympathy. "Right," said Charles. "It's time for us to head back." He turned around and everyone followed him, unable to tell what he was thinking or how he was feeling. The sky had become dark, and Charles and his team were on their way back to the city. As they walked along, some women from Rosa's group stopped Elena and spoke to her, but they didn't reach an agreement, so they left and said that they would return later. Charles wasn't concerned. In his opinion, Dawn City was a place for equality and respect regardless of one's sex. There are men who treat women badly, just as there are women who treat men badly, he thought. I want Dawn City to be a place where difference is accepted and discrimination has no place. I hope Elena's okay, but if she needs to vent her feelings, I wish she'd come and talk to me, not to people I don't really know. I know the value of being able to talk a problem through with someone. Elena's a first-rate member of my team, and I want her to grow and move forward. After returning to Dawn City, Charles was just about to return to his residence to cultivate when he was called over by Olivia. Having always been attracted to her, Charles used to have to be very careful not to let his feelings for her change his behavior toward her. But now, he was much more confident of his self-control and knew he should set a good example for his team. The two met in Olivia's villa and began to discuss the dangers of the region around Dawn City. After a short while, she decided to change the subject and asked him, "So, what do you think about the paranormals I've trained to be my assistants? You must have seen how well they cooperated with our troops on the battlefield." "Yes," Charles replied simply. "So does that make me your best level 5 officer?" she asked, not being completely serious, but hoping for some banter with Charles. "You're good," he replied. "You know that. Stop fishing for compliments." "Well, there'd be no point in doing that with you, would there?" Olivia said, laughing. "Have you ever told me or anyone else that we're doing a good job?" "You know me," Charles replied with a smile. "No news is good news. You'll hear soon enough if I have a problem with you or anyone else." "I did train them well, though," Olivia said. "You can at least admit that." I've helped a lot of paranormals rise through the cultivation levels. You have, answered Charles. I'll give you that much. But as nice as it is to sit here and chat, I get the feeling your training skills aren't really what you wanted to talk to me about. So what's up? Olivia looked lost in thought, so Charles didn't press her. She'll talk when she's good and ready, he thought. I know her well, and she knows me well too. She was the second person to suspect that something was different about me due to my knowledge from my past life. The only other person is Colonel Morrison, but he didn't say anything much about it. What Charles didn't know was that Richard Morrison had always thought that Charles would become an expert cultivator. He had seen Charles almost like a child who was bright from a very early age, eager to learn, but also humble. Richard was no fortune teller, but he did have the gift of foresight and wasn't at all surprised to see how Charles had risen through the ranks to become a great leader and master cultivator. Olivia started to speak, breaking into Charles's reverie, and he sat up straighter to give her his full attention. The main reservoir and the river have been badly polluted with zombie blood from all the fighting, she said. Because the river is fast-flowing, pollution levels aren't quite as bad there as they are in the reservoir, but it's still not safe. We have to warn everyone not to drink from these sources. We don't want thousands of sick or infected people on our hands. Go on, said Charles. I assume you have a plan. Yes, Olivia replied. The water purified by the Dragon Pearl can be drunk safely. Of course, people from the outlying strongholds and other groups will want to come here to buy our clean water, and we could make a small fortune from it. Good thinking, said Charles, smiling. Aside from this incident with zombie blood pollution, the rivers generally are getting more and more polluted with all sorts of nasty viruses. Not everyone can boil their water to kill the germs in it, and even though most people who have reached at least level 3 are naturally immune to viral disease, anyone at a lower level is likely to get serious infections. Olivia responded, The world is changing rapidly and getting more dangerous. Do you think we'll ever be able to go back to the way we were, live how we used to live? She looked at Charles, and he could see great sadness and nostalgia in her eyes, mixed with something else. She was a strong person, one of the strongest he knew, but she could still be overcome by her emotions at times. You look upset, said Charles, and you only ever let your true feelings show in front of me and your sister. So I know all the changes must have hit you pretty hard, but society has always had to face up to disasters and problems, and the human race has survived up to now. If we can survive this era, we might have a brighter future ahead of us. You know that's not the answer I wanted, Olivia replied, gazing suggestively at him. Finally catching her drift, Charles flashed a sly smile and said, Just trust me. We'll make it through together. Then he leaned in and wrapped his arms around her, and they fell to the bed behind her in each other's embrace. The next morning, Charles looked at Olivia curled up on the bed and couldn't help but wonder what was really on her mind. Many men desired a woman like her, a woman with a strong temperament and outstanding beauty. In his previous life, Charles had occasionally slept with such women as a way to escape his despair, but he had lost his direction in life and had been just going through the motions. He thought a strong and talented woman like Olivia would be miserable in a new era, but as long as she survived, she would surely make a name for herself with all her accomplishments. But since Charles had searched the vicinity of Montreal in his past life and hadn't heard mention of her, he was afraid that meant she would die before the apocalypse was over. Too many people had died in the tide of history, so it was the most likely scenario. Olivia wasn't naive enough to think the world could return to the way it had been before the apocalypse. Her ambitions were smaller than that. She simply wanted to have a bright and beautiful life, one that was tidy and uncomplicated. But most of all, she just wanted to live. But her life had sunk to the lowest standard she could endure. If the state of the world grew worse, or her life any messier, she didn't think she could take it. The truth was that she was terrified, but she knew she couldn't tell anyone that. If the deputy mayor of Dawn City showed any weakness, the Dawnians would lose confidence in her. She couldn't let that happen. Fortunately, she still had Charles to help her. She stood up and looked at him reproachfully. Don't tell anyone about what happened last night, she said. Let's just pretend nothing happened. Miranda said the same thing, Charles teased. She rolled her eyes and said, You really did sleep with her, didn't you? Olivia knew that already, of course. She and Miranda were close. and Miranda wouldn't keep something like that from her. But she didn't mind it too much. She wouldn't get involved with anyone who couldn't help her survive, no matter how good they were for her. Olivia was intelligent, and the rational part of her brain had calculated the safest option. She had decided she would rather be unhappy and secure than happy and exposed. That was why she wouldn't put in any effort with Charles. They were only using each other to get what they needed, and she knew he understood that too. But then again, you and Miranda are pretty similar, Charles said. He knew this wasn't just an issue of security, and that he couldn't rush it. Miranda and Olivia had a good relationship with each other, but both of them were strong-willed and were having a hard time accepting that they had been with the same man. He knew they wouldn't be in a hurry to share him. If they hadn't been in the middle of the apocalypse, this predicament would never have happened. Olivia was a prideful woman and would never be happy with such a compromise. But Charles was optimistic. Considering how powerful he was, he believed there would be no shortage of women pursuing him sooner or later. "Charles, what do you think will happen to Dawn City in the future?" Olivia asked. "Sometimes I'm afraid that even Dawn City will inevitably turn into ruins." "We're strong enough to protect all of this," he said firmly, leaving no room for argument. "It doesn't matter what kind of enemies we face in the future. As long as we don't give up, there's still hope." During his past life, he had already experienced the darkest times in the last 10 years of the apocalypse, but he still hadn't given up. Although he had lost all the people around him, Charles had known that too many people's hopes had depended on his life, so he had struggled to keep on living, even once he had known his last moment had been coming. He was very grateful he had been reborn. He knew he had to cherish his new life and everything he had in it. "You're right. As long as we don't give up, there's still hope," Olivia repeated. She suddenly wrapped her arms around Charles's neck, wanting to open her heart to him and be united with him. "Even if the world is engulfed in flames, we'll protect our city. I can't do it on my own, and neither can you. It's too hard. We can only do it if we work together." "Are you still flirting with me?" he asked with a wry smile. He could see that she didn't really like him very much. It was only doing this because she wanted to survive. But it didn't matter to him whether she genuinely liked him or was only seeking a sense of security. Either way was okay with him. He felt stronger with her by his side. Olivia trembled as she looked up into Charles's charming eyes and thought of the previous night's compromise. She was very beautiful, which had only made her proud. But even a proud person like her would eventually compromise because she didn't want to die. She reasoned that it was just her survival instinct kicking in, and that excuse comforted her. She could continue pretending not to care. "Why don't you open a harem?" she teased. "With all the energy you've spent in bed with all these women, let's see how much you have left to do your job as mayor and protect our city." "Is that what you think?" he asked. "I'll try to protect everyone. That's my priority. But one day you'll see that your safety depends on how capable you are, and not on me." He turned and left the room, glancing back blankly at her for a moment before shutting the door behind him. What he had said was unpleasant to hear, but it was also the truth. There were countless other people for him to worry about besides Olivia, and he didn't know which of them he would be able to save before the apocalypse was over. Olivia would need to rely on her own abilities to ensure her survival. Charles couldn't make any promises, because he couldn't guarantee he could keep them. He knew it was better to be harshly honest. This was the end of the world after all. Relying on others too much would only lead to one thing: an earlier death. Charles hadn't paid attention to the date for a long time, but a few days after his conversation with Olivia, he realized that almost 2 months had passed since the apocalypse had begun. In that short period of time, the two of them had grown closer. He recognized that it took a certain amount of courage for people to follow him, but it couldn't be helped. While there were many benefits to following him, the danger was also great. His best fighters, and those under Olivia's command, had spent the previous few days training by killing many mutated beasts and powerful zombies. They'd even cleared out 2 small zombie groups. The military siege of Butte had ended. They had destroyed most of the zombies, and those that remained posed only a limited threat to the survivors. The military had wanted to keep surrounding Butte, but they knew that continuing the siege would be a serious logistical challenge and a burden on their weapon and ammunition supply. After instructing some survivors to build a survival base and giving them some weapons to protect themselves, they had departed to start a new operation elsewhere. They had too many problems to deal with and couldn't afford to focus all their energy on Butte. According to the information Charles had gathered, more than 20,000 soldiers have been injured in this battle, but more than 10,000 people had also been saved. Many of the passionate young men had chosen to join the army and fight the zombies, even if it meant sacrificing their lives. Charles heaved a sigh as he thought about this loss. The Montreal army had started with less than 500,000 soldiers. When the apocalypse had arrived, the early rescue operation had caused a huge loss to their numbers. Even if some veterans had returned to the army, their total number would have been only 300,000. The more new people they recruited, the safer the entire region would be, because the army had always been a powerful force that no one underestimated. Charles had collected more Crimson Flame Energy gems and Blue Flame Energy gems, and had used them to forge some weapons to give as rewards for those who performed well. He also checked in with the Stone Man back in the Stellar Technology mines. The creature had already reached level 4, but it still hadn't formed a clan with the others in the mine yet. Charles wasn't in a hurry, though. Before the Stone Man reached level 5, he would give it a chance to transform. No matter how much growth potential the Stone Man had, it couldn't possibly catch up to the Lightning Cadaver Serpent. But it had its own use. At the very least, it could help Charles guard the mineral vein so that the materials could be excavated once they became more valuable in the future. Charles's energy storage space was also doing well. Some crops from the fields inside were already being harvested, which meant he had sufficient food reserves, and he had more confidence to carry out his future plans in turn. He knew that if he truly wanted to support others during the apocalypse, he needed to make the proper preparations first. Dawn City's population had already reached 150,000, but the trend of expansion had already stopped. The number of permanent residents was actually declining, while the number of travelers passing through had increased. The population of a region was always limited by the natural resources available. The Dawnians relied on their own labor for everything, but once all the precious materials nearby had been collected, those who had wanted more had to go further and further away to find them. This had led to an increase in the number of level 5 paranormals in various places, as well as the establishment of many more survival bases. The military regularly sent messages to every survival base, and if the army or any of the survival bases encountered danger, they could ask for help from one another. Most of the survival bases agreed to this mutually beneficial arrangement, but some of the bases chose to remain independent and isolated. As they ran out of resources, though, it was only a matter of time before they would fall apart, so many powerful super squads had emerged. They relied on killing zombies to survive. They looted the creatures as corpses for valuable parts, and then they went to Dawn City to trade them for everything they wanted. Sometimes, this included women. Dawn City didn't allow human trafficking, but some Dawnian women placed their hopes of survival in the men who came to trade, and so they went with them in exchange for protection. Charles dealt mercilessly with anyone who tried to force a woman to leave the city, but if they went willingly, there was nothing he could do. Intervening would only send those women to their deaths. As Charles reflected on the latest happenings in the city, he felt gratified about the change in his sister. Although Lena hadn't abandoned the idea of becoming a savior, she had matured and had gained a lot of trust as the captain of the city guard. After all, Charles's prestige had naturally carried over to her. Even so, it gave Charles a headache to think that his sister still hadn't given up on Kevin. Charles thought he was an idiot and wanted to throttle him. It made him angry that Kevin had deserted Lena. Charles had expected people to pursue his sister, but he didn't understand how she had fallen for a man who seemed like he wouldn't return her feelings. She hadn't even had an opportunity to get close to him, yet she was still infatuated with him. To make matters worse, Charles had saved Kevin's life, and he sometimes wondered if that had been a mistake. Part of him had thought that if he had known Kevin would treat his sister so carelessly, he wouldn't have let him live. But that was only a stray thought. Since Kevin had helped him in his past life, Charles felt obligated to repay the favor. It was the right thing to do. And although Kevin was a little aloof, he wasn't fickle, which was more than Charles could say about himself. He decided to wait and see what would happen with Lena and Kevin. Besides, he had more important things to occupy his attention. He had been thinking night and day about forming the Order of Knights, and he had already made a lot of preparations to fully arm the people he wanted to bring with him to Hell. The trip might be dangerous, but he knew it was impossible to survive the apocalypse without taking risks. Charles watched the troops gather under the watchtower. He glanced at Alice, who was sleeping soundly, and then he turned his gaze to the north. He had an enemy to kill there. He hadn't written off all his grudges after he had been reborn. Even if he had chosen to be magnanimous, at the rate his power was growing, it was inevitable that he would become their enemy regardless. Olivia and Miranda appeared behind him. "The team has been assembled," Miranda said. He smiled. "No one's prepared to leave." "Before you leave, there's something you should know," Olivia said awkwardly. 17 people from the original team aren't here and can't participate in this operation. Charles frowned. "Why didn't you say something sooner? This will affect the whole mission." He was frustrated by the deserters. They weren't technically real soldiers, so he'd always given them an out. If they were afraid, they could quit in the beginning of their training. But once they committed to following Charles, he would assign them positions and expect them to show up. He found it cowardly for them to quit right when danger came. Their absence would affect the entire team. Olivia could see how furious Charles was becoming, so she hurried to explain. "They didn't want to leave, but after we rebuilt the hospital, I conducted physical examinations on everyone, and 17 of them are pregnant." "What?" Oliver squawked in surprise. Charles's anger instantly deflated. He was also dumbfounded. "Everyone's under a lot of pressure right now," Miranda added. "It's normal to find ways to release that pressure. Many of the women on your team want to remain unattached, but they still want to have fun." Charles was speechless. He hadn't expected this problem at all. He knew it was very dangerous for a woman to become pregnant during such unstable times, so he'd always been careful with his partners. But that didn't mean everyone else thought the same way. Many women had joined Charles's team because they had wanted to forge an independent path like Elena had. But they had needed a way to relieve the stress of life, and it had created quite an awkward situation. Feeling a headache coming on, he rubbed his forehead. Things had gotten complicated. "Do you have any suggestions?" he asked. "Although we have excellent living facilities in Dawn City, not everyone is aware of contraceptives," Olivia said seriously. "And in my research, I found that many people want a child once their lives have settled down a little. A child offers hope during this dark time, even if the parents know the child may not live." She knew that hope was essential. The reason many people despaired of life wasn't simply because of the pressure, but because the pressure was so great that they couldn't see any hope of overcoming it. They had had to suffer through that turmoil at the beginning of the apocalypse, but now that Dawn City was becoming so prosperous, many people wanted to have children. They reasoned that even if they couldn't survive, at least their child had a chance. As for how to actually raise the child and give them a good environment in a dangerous world, no one had the answer to that. Even in peaceful times, not everyone was cut out to be a parent. Now that many people treated their children as spiritual sustenance, having children was an even more troublesome idea. Charles smiled bitterly, thinking this was ridiculous. He had seen many tragedies in his previous life. Several pregnant women had struggled to survive, and in the end, 2 lives had often been lost instead of 1. Even when mothers had successfully given birth, many of the babies had been too fragile to survive. They had been easily contaminated by the outside world, or their parents had struggled to feed them. Only those who had truly established themselves had had the confidence to raise children. But when the weather had worsened and an even greater disaster had descended upon them, the world had grown even more tragic, turning into a sort of purgatory for all of the families just trying to survive. Charles didn't want the world to fall into such a terrible state again, and he knew he had to be careful. He thought he had calculated everything to get Dawn City on the right track, but he hadn't accounted for such a thing to happen. "Forget it," he said, waving a dismissive hand. "Let's separate the men and women for now, and when you recruit members to the Order of Knights in the future, examine all the women first. Don't let this happen again." This miscalculation made Charles feel powerless. He found it even more troublesome than battling tens of thousands of zombies. He could also foresee that when the women started giving birth, things might become even more complicated. "This is a mess," he thought. "I almost regret creating Dawn City." He felt a chill down his spine as he thought about the troubles he might face in the future. If he hadn't found out about the pregnancies, he would have been able to focus entirely on more pressing matters. But once he had learned about them, he couldn't overlook them. A sudden thought hit Charles. Kevin seemed to have been preparing for such a situation from the beginning. Even though he hadn't been reborn like Charles had, he could somehow predict the enemy's moves. Because of the pregnancy incident, the team's departure was delayed a whole day, and the pregnant members were removed from the Order of Knights. Olivia devised a new system to allow the women to continue working during pregnancy. She wasn't trying to be cruel by putting them to work, but Dawn City couldn't waste its resources on people who didn't contribute. Fortunately, everyone's physical strength had improved. Most of the women's pregnancies didn't affect their ability to work. It was mainly because of moral considerations that they were no longer allowed to participate in battle. They might not have been able to fight, but with their physical fitness, they could still do farm work. The next morning, Charles's Order of Knights regrouped, but his burst of energy from the day before was gone. His previously high spirits had disappeared, and he felt a little helpless instead. Alice had long been prepared for her moment. Under Charles's guidance, she slowly released the seal on the gate of hell inside her body. Alice raised her hands, and the spell array under her feet shone with a 5-colored light. She was using elemental restoration to help recover her energy and keep her from falling into a weakened state, which would make her more dependent on the gate of hell. Charles said to the Order of Knights, "I can tell you without a doubt that this journey will be very dangerous. You might even lose your lives inside. If you choose to stay behind now, you can still live a good life with all the strength you have left." Mark smiled and said, "Don't say that, sir. We've chosen this path, and now we have to walk it." The others called out in agreement. "That's right, we have to fight. Yeah, we can't have the paranormals looking down on us. We want exciting lives, not happy ones. We want to get even stronger." All of their eyes were filled with passion. They knew the mission would only make them stronger. In the past 2 months, they had seen countless people breathe their last breath in battle, and they had seen others starve to death on the streets. Some had even seen people they used to know appear in front of them as zombies, and they had seen many low-level soldiers give their devotion to cruel leaders in order to survive. But the members of the Order of Knights hadn't been willing to submit themselves to a life of grievance. They would rather have the freedom to make their own choices, even if those choices led to death. Some people had mocked them, and had wondered why they followed Charles, asking why the Knights couldn't survive on their own with their skills and equipment. But they had laughed at those people when I returned their questions, asking if they enjoyed scavenging for scraps and living like rats instead of pursuing a better life. Everyone had their own values, their own thoughts, and their own way of living. The way the Knights saw it, there was no right or wrong, only choices and consequences. Perhaps they would die in battle, their final bloom of brilliance fading to nothing. But if there was even a sliver of hope for a brighter future, they were willing to fight for it. Even if that radiance was destined to be extinguished by the boundless darkness, they didn't care. As long as the light they released was brilliant enough to make them feel that their efforts hadn't been in vain, that was enough for them. A black gate opened. A vast aura came from the other side, and it felt a bit familiar to the soldiers. The gate of hell inside Alice's body had been modified so that it opened to the exact location of the Cerberus that Charles had caught. This modification had a downside. The more power Alice borrowed from the gate of hell, the more obvious her location became. If some powerful entities in hell wanted to attack the human world, then Alice would become their compass and their springboard for such an attack. The gate of hell's power was dangerous. The stronger it grew, the more likely that people would become addicted to it. But Charles had no choice. He had to borrow that power. Many Dawnians were already very satisfied with their lives. Compared to the famine they had suffered before, being able to eat their fill in Dawn City made them happy. But Charles wasn't satisfied. He never could be. In his new life, he knew he had to sail against the current. Those who were satisfied with their lives would grow lazy and eventually be swept away. As the mayor of Dawn City, he had to keep pushing them to work harder. It was his responsibility as their leader. If that meant taking huge risks, so be it. Elena entered the gate of hell first, and Tina, Hugh, and Tommy followed close behind. Miranda instructed Olivia, "While we're in hell, you're in charge of Dawn City." Olivia smiled. Don't talk like you're going to die. With that scumbag Charles around, what's the worst that can happen to you guys? Yeah, that jerk always makes things work out somehow, Miranda said, and then she walked through the gate. Dale, Anthony, and Zach went after her. Calvin didn't go with them because his light element would be too conspicuous in hell. Charles stood beside Alice and stroked her hair. I know it's been hard for you lately, he said. Alice had been spending all her time learning to control and adapt to the power of the Gate of Hell. At the same time, she had also been learning the laws of water. She'd wanted to live an easy life, but she'd given up practically everything for Charles. Every day, she wholeheartedly comprehended the essence of power. Alice smiled and said, "The pressure you bear is greater than anyone's." Charles didn't respond. He just quietly walked through the gate. He believed he would come back, so he saw no point in saying a sad goodbye. After Charles entered, Alice closed the Gate of Hell, and then Lena appeared from around the corner looking hesitant. Alice cocked her head at her. "Why weren't you here to see your brother off?" "Why should I have been?" Lena asked stubbornly. "It's not like I won't see him again." She turned away. Lena had experienced too many disasters and had witnessed too many tragedies. She was used to hiding her tears and putting on a strong act in front of everyone. She knew that no one could shoulder the responsibility of leading everyone alone. The stronger she became, the more she could help ease her brother's burden. Having a weak little sister would only increase the pressure on Charles. Olivia patted Lena's shoulder, but didn't say anything. She understood Lena's thoughts, and she wished that Lena didn't have to bear such a heavy weight at her age. She thought that Lena should get to live a carefree life, but with the world as it was, that was impossible. Not everyone got to choose the life they wanted. Knowing the trials they were all bound to face together, Lena thought, "I'll protect Dawn City until the day I die." As they walked through the Gate of Hell, the group of over 300 knights were enthusiastic and itching for a fight. They couldn't wait to earn some glory, but they hadn't been at all prepared for the oppressive heat that greeted them in Hell, and many of them cried out, "It's so hot here! Do you have any water? I need something to cool me down." "Oh, come on! We can handle this heat. It's nothing!" A deep blue flame burned nearby. Those who had dealt with paranormals quickly recognized the flame as hellfire. It didn't get close enough to burn them, but it was excruciatingly hot. Even the heat wave blowing against their faces was enough to make them want to strip their armor off. Inside the raging hellfire, wraith-like creatures let out mournful wails, as if they were enduring some unbearable torture. "So this is hell?" one of the knights asked in astonishment. All of them were shocked. Nothing could have prepared them for such a harsh environment. A huge shadow enveloped them. The Order of Knights looked up to see a giant, three-headed monster glaring down at them and drooling as if it were looking at its next meal. "Are you my lunch?" it asked. The knights all froze in terror and argued with one another. "What is this thing? Should we run?" "Of course not. The mayor's prepared for this." "Yeah, don't worry. Mayor Federer is here." Charles had arrived right after his Order of Knights, but even those who had seen the Cerberus before were frightened by its enormous aura. Dale couldn't help but sigh. He had thought that reaching level 5 would make him an expert, but now he understood that he had only just begun to walk down that path. He had accumulated enough resources to forcefully increase his cultivation until he had broken through to level 5. But as he stood in front of the Cerberus, he still felt like an ant. After their initial shock at sensing the Cerberus's mighty aura, the knights felt their hearts surge with a heroic spirit that overcame their fear. Even though the monster was powerful, it was essentially Charles's pet. The knights hoped to one day be strong enough to make such a powerful creature submit to their will. They didn't know how difficult that might be, but that didn't stop them from dreaming about it. Anthony's eyes flashed with a strange light. "I want a pet like this too," he muttered. Their spirits lifted as they thought about how their mayor had subdued the monster. If he had been able to do that, then nothing was impossible. It made them even more confident in their future. But Helen, who was seeing the Cerberus for the first time, was so frightened that her face paled, and she hid behind Charles, clinging to him and trembling. "Don't be afraid. It won't hurt you," Charles said. He smiled and patted her arm gently. Then he walked toward the Cerberus. I'm a lot stronger now, and I can help you recover more strength too. The last time he had encountered the Cerberus's bloodline power, he had experienced a wave of dizziness. But now he had condensed the divine seed and had gone through a period of tempering. He was countless times stronger than he had been the last time, and he also had the confidence to suppress curses. The Cerberus said, Our pack has already been waiting for a long time, and we're not in a hurry. Strengthening only one of us won't be much help to our pack. The most important thing you can do right now is to increase your strength as much as possible so you can help us all. This hadn't been the creature's idea, but that of the Cerberus pack alphas. The Cerberus had initially wanted to take back a portion of their territory, but Charles and the alphas had persuaded it to wait. They knew that unless Charles grew stronger first, they would lose whatever land they tried to reclaim, and they were afraid they wouldn't be able to take back what belonged to them at all, unless Charles helped them. All right, Charles said. According to our previous agreement, the Cerberus pack will lead the battle. Our army will eliminate some of Hell's vengeful spirits, but I'll also help you directly. After the battle, the two-horned horses and nightmare horses in your territory will sign a contract with us. That won't be a problem, replied the Cerberus. We'll sign a contract with those two groups to make them your mounts, but you'll be responsible for protecting them from harm. Charles said, Then that's what we'll do. That was Hell's rule. Those who wanted to borrow the power of Hell had to pay the price. Although the two-horned horses weren't a powerful race, they were still creatures of Hell. A legion of two-headed hellhounds and ordinary hellhounds appeared behind the Cerberus, forming a mighty army, and soon they were ready to set off toward their target. A march through Hell wasn't as complicated as it would have been in the human world. Once everyone had assembled, they could set off immediately, with no need to gather equipment or consider other logistics. Charles was organizing his knights when Miranda said, Aren't you going to give your order of knights a name? A true army has to have a name to rally behind and boost morale. All the knights turned to Charles, passion burning in their eyes. If they had an official title, then they would be a real army. They could feel the excitement in their souls. Let's call it the Dawn Order of Knights, Anthony suggested, and then he shrugged. We're an order of knights from Dawn City, and after this mission, we'll be the ones protecting the city. Everyone thought this was a good idea at first. If they returned from Hell, they would become the city's main fighting force, so it made sense to call themselves the Dawn Order of Knights. But one by one, they all hesitated as they realized that wouldn't work. Olivia was already forming an army to protect Dawn City, and that army would have to be called the Dawn Army. The names would be too similar and too confusing, and they wanted to stay separate from Olivia's army. It wasn't that they wanted to be divided, but they did want to recognize their unique position with a unique name. When anyone mentioned their name, they wanted to feel proud. Charles looked around at everyone's expecting gazes, and he had an idea. We came from the human realm to Hell, he said, and we'll have to return to the human realm after we achieve victory here. Since we can travel between Hell and the human realm, we might as well call ourselves. He trailed off for dramatic effect and swept a piercing gaze over the crowd. The Knights of Hell. Charles knew how important it was for an army to have a title. Without one, it hardly mattered how many troops they recruited or how well equipped they were. They would be aimless, lacking all structure and motivation. With the right name, though, the soldiers of an army had something to rally around. They had a common goal, something to fight for together. At the beginning of the apocalypse, Charles had been so accustomed to being alone that he hadn't given much thought to armies or how to unite them. At that moment, though, Miranda had reminded him of the value of giving their army a name, and he realized, looking back through history, that it had always been this way. The Knights of Hell were proud to be united under such a legendary name. As soon as they had decided on it, they couldn't help chatting eagerly amongst themselves, egging each other on. The Knights of Hell, that's us! We're going to Hell and come back in one piece. As Mark listened to their exclamations, he felt glory stirring in his heart. Follow me and fight, he shouted. Under his command, the Knights' morale grew. They met with the Cerberus Pack's army, which was made of thousands of hellhounds and a variety of other hellish creatures. Some almost looked human. On their way forward through hell, the knights encountered various rotten creatures that moaned miserably, but were so used to the fiery landscape that the knights' hellfire attacks hardly seemed to hurt them at all. Even though the hellhounds tore many of them to pieces, this didn't seem to bother the creatures. They carried on their advance as though they weren't simply unafraid of death, but were completely unaware of it as a concept. So relentless was their onslaught, and so great their numbers, that before long, many of the hellhounds had sustained serious injuries. "Why do the hellhounds have to fight in close combat?" asked Anthony. "Why not just cast hellfire like they do in the world above?" Zack pointed to the flames. "This place is full of hellfire. The creatures down here have built up a resistance to it." Dale and the others' hearts sank. One of the Cerberus Pack's greatest strengths was that its hounds could absorb hellfire unscathed. This was an important asset in the mortal world, but hardly unique in hell, where the creatures they were up against were just as immune to the flames as they were. It also meant that many of the knights' powers did little damage. "These ghouls are the lowest level creatures in hell," said Charles. "They don't have much power, but as you can see, they're resistant to hellfire. Don't be afraid, though. We'll be able to defeat them with our strength alone, not to mention our weapons." "Let me try," said Mark, running forward and swinging his axe at one of the ghouls, splitting the monster in two. "Don't be afraid, everyone," he called out. "Look, these monsters are weak." The other knights were awed by how easily Mark had slain the ghoul. In their eyes, he was a great warrior, second only to the ancient martial artists of legend. He had been born with divine power, which multiplied a fighter's natural strength. In addition, Charles had designed Mark's weapon specifically with his talents in mind, and it raised his abilities as power up to level 5. His great feats inspired the others to join in the battle. Following his example, they found the ghouls weren't much more difficult to kill than the zombies they were used to. "He's right, the monsters are weak," said one of them. "Don't be too proud," said Charles. "Remember that our weapons are very strong." "That's right," said Miranda. "They're as powerful as level 4 weapons." "So don't be fooled into thinking these ghouls are totally harmless," said Charles. No sooner had he given this warning than one of the knights was scratched on the arm by a ghoul. Helen rushed to him. Although her attack power was relatively weak, she was very agile and was at his side in next to no time. The soldier yelled, watching in horror as a black rot began to spread up his arm. "Quick!" he cried. "Cut it off!" He screamed not only with the physical pain of his injury, but also the torment of knowing he would soon lose his combat strength. He had known that their journey into hell would be fraught with perils, but he hadn't expected to encounter such horror so early in their expedition. "Don't worry, it won't come to that," said Helen softly. She ignited a green healing light in her palm and pressed it into the soldier's wound. The black rot quickly faded until his skin returned to its normal hue. "My abilities are particularly effective against this poison," she said. When the other knights saw how quickly Helen had healed their comrade, their confidence rose even higher. Until that moment, they had been doing their best to make sure they wouldn't be harmed. But once they saw that Helen could save them even from horrible injuries, they were emboldened to fight. "Don't be careless," called out Charles, sensing the hope in the air. "Helen is our only healer. She won't be able to save everyone. Our mission here is to help the Cerberus Pack get rid of these monsters. We're up against many enemies, and it'll be a protracted battle, so you need to make sure you're protecting yourselves." "Yes, sir!" the knights called out in unison. Meanwhile, Miranda was deep in thought. "Maybe we have a chance of success here after all," she said. It had seemed at first that this kind of harsh environment would weaken humans, but the knights found that as long as they avoided the hellfire, they could cause a great deal of damage against the creatures using their skills and weapons. In fact, their power over the hellish creatures was almost as great as that of the hellhounds over the humans themselves. "That's right," said Charles. "The creatures down here may be immune to hellfire, but because we've developed more powers than just hellfire, we still pose a major threat." These special powers meant that they could easily cause great damage to the hellish creatures. And of course, the more of the creatures they dispatched, the easier things went for the Cerberus Pack. After the fighting had been going on for a short while, an eerie darkness descended. It wasn't clear at first where it was coming from, but then one of the Cerberus Pack members howled in fury and cried, "There they are! Those traitors!" Traitor? One of the knights asked. What's it talking about? The others were just as puzzled, but then they followed the hound's line of sight and beheld a hound far larger than any in the Cerberus pack. The knights cried out with fear. When the Cerberus pack was cursed, some of the creatures that had been loyal to them left their side and chose to go their own way, Charles explained. Some hellhounds made their own packs, turning against the Cerberus pack, while others even fed on their own kin. Charles had been told this by the Cerberus he had a contract with. Of all the traitors to the Cerberus pack, the most infamous were the followers of the giant corpse hound. They had originally lived in the Cerberus pack's territory as their servants before turning against the pack. The previous owner of Charles's ancient book had given the hellhounds' territory a certain level of security, preventing the various lords of hell from entering. But although the area was safe from external enemies, when the Cerberus pack began to lose power, its subordinates began to see it as weak. In other words, the reason that the pack's territory began to shrink wasn't because of enemies from without, but turncoats from within. That's disgusting, said Anthony. The only reason they gained any strength in the first place was because of the Cerberus pack. How could they betray it like that? They saw themselves on completely different sides, said Miranda, sighing. Hush, interrupted Charles. We need to defend our position. Still, he couldn't help asking himself the question. Had he been a hellhound, would he have remained loyal to the weakening Cerberus pack? Or would he have betrayed them and struck out for a more prosperous situation? After all, it's in the nature of all living things to betray, he thought. As soon as you can see an opportunity to become stronger, you have to take it. In this world where the strong prey on the weak, you need to take every chance you can get. But he was firmly on the Cerberus pack's side. For one thing, he was relying on the Cerberus' power to carry out his own plans, so he had to fight for it now. Whether he was doing the right or wrong thing didn't matter to him. It was just what he needed to do to see his plans come to fruition. It wasn't difficult to spot the giant corpse hounds. They were covered in patches of shaggy fur, mostly black, but with sickly yellow strands, broken here and there with exposed rotten flesh where they had been wounded. The hounds of the Cerberus pack charged at them, black flames pouring from their mouths, twisting together into a great pillar of fire that reduced more than a dozen of the giant corpse hounds to ashes. This was true hellfire, a more powerful flame than standard hellfire. 6 two-headed hellhounds also joined the fray, baring their fangs and tearing at the giant corpse hounds. A particularly large giant corpse hound lunged from its pack and spat the same black flames back at the Cerberuses. Scorching heat blasted out in all directions, incinerating countless low-level hellish creatures in its wake. The miserable creatures screeched as they rolled on the ground. Even some of the giant corpse hounds were left gasping for breath and howling in pain as they were caught in the flames. Outside the arena of battle, the knights looked on, stunned. I thought we were strong, said Miranda, but they're at a completely different level. Dale shook his head in disbelief. I thought when I reached level 5 I'd be stronger than anything, but these hellhounds are something else. Although level 5 paranormals were extremely powerful in the human world, with enough sway to easily command a faction of 1,000 people, they were nothing compared to a Cerberus. Charles knew that they shouldn't take the comparison to heart. They have their fight, and we have ours, he said. Then he turned to Elena, Hugh, and the others. All of you, charge at the giant corpse hounds around the edges. Remember, you're wearing the armor I made for you. As long as you're careful and don't get caught in the middle of everything, you won't come to harm. Now go. Yes, sir, they shouted, and they rushed to the battlefield. Elena activated the Terminator sword ability and entered an almost trance-like state, immediately dispatching a small group of the hounds. With a dazzling red lotus blooming at the end of her crimson flame sword, she sliced at several of the hounds, backed up by a group of hellhounds that followed close behind her. Meanwhile, Tina, Tommy, and Hugh weren't to be outdone. They slashed and swiped with their own swords, taking down any giant corpse hound unlucky enough to cross their paths. Thanks to the emboldening power of their weapons, their strength was firmly at level 5. Dealing with the lower-level giant corpse hounds was a piece of cake. Anthony looked at the 4 of them enviously. Charles, he said, will I ever have their strength? Despite having the same summoning powers as Dale, Anthony preferred to fight with his fists, staying true to the martial arts cultivation techniques that Charles had taught him. Miranda and the others had also encouraged him to continue with his martial arts training, as they knew it would increase his ability to protect himself and others. Although Anthony had originally been stronger than Tina, Tommy, and Hugh, they had quickly caught up to his level. However, Charles knew that it was important for him to remember that a great deal of the others' strength was because of their weapons. "Don't worry," Charles said to him. "You'll show your strength a different way. We haven't yet come up with any equipment suited to your abilities, but once we find it, you'll reach a power far greater than any of them." Anthony nodded, reminding himself that while he didn't have powerful weapons, he was still a master of magic. No matter how great the combat powers of his fellow knights, they would always need a summoner like Anthony to assist them in battle. "Get ready to help," said Miranda. "I'll do the same." She launched herself into the battle like an arrow from a bow. Her speed was already great, and it increased when she used the blood-drinking sword. Dale and the other elemental paranormals were ready to support her from behind. Any one of them alone was a force to be reckoned with, but when they all worked together, they were nearly unstoppable. Charles turned from watching his team to the leader of the giant corpse hounds, which was fighting one of the two-headed hellhounds. They were at the very center of the fight, the same place he had warned his knights to avoid. "And that beast is at level 6, surrounded by its pack and fighting for its life," he said. "Shouldn't pose too much of a problem." A long sword appeared in Charles's hand, and a cocky smile spread across his face as he stepped into the battle. "Charles, what are you doing?" shouted Zack, spotting an unnerving determination in Charles's eyes. He watched helplessly as his leader walked headlong into the battle between the hellhounds. Even if he managed to get anywhere near without being swept aside, he ran the risk of being burned by the true hellfire. Even the slightest singe of this fire would be enough to put his life in danger. "We humans can't fight down here for long," Charles called out behind him. "If we can't end this battle quickly, the hellfire will turn us all to ashes, so we need to end it, and soon." And with that, he carried on his approach toward the hellhounds. "Human, stay back," the two-headed hellhound warned him. "This is too dangerous for you." It didn't want anything to happen to Charles. It knew that he was the Cerberus Pack's only hope of removing the curse and recovering its former strength. The Cerberus, seeing Charles arrive, said, "This is the human who has helped our master. He's stronger than the others. He doesn't need our protection." Naturally, the Cerberus Pack had great respect for their master. They saw Charles as his successor, so they could guess at how powerful he was. Also, they could clearly see how far Charles had come since their first meeting, and they trusted him as an equal. As such, it wasn't their place to tell him not to join the battle. Any danger that befell him would be his own responsibility. Charles wielded the Hell Sword he had taken from the Nether Knight, a deadly weapon which had been forged from unholy cold iron. Most of his swords weren't as powerful as his innate sword energy, but having a weapon in hand meant he could reserve some of this energy. Although the Extract Amulet would replenish it eventually, he needed to hold on to as much as he could. In his previous life, there had been many occasions that he had spent all his energy in the heat of battle, giving him precious little for when he needed to make an escape. He had since learned the importance of reserving his energy. The times that he did, he would likely encounter some particularly formidable opponent toward the end of the battle, and be glad he had reserved sufficient energy to fight them. Although the battle between the Hellhounds seemed at first to be evenly matched, the Cerberus Pack had some distinct advantages. Before meeting Charles, for example, the Cerberuses had only been able to use level 7 abilities briefly in combat. But after Charles had sealed their curse, they could sustain this level of power consistently again. Although the leader of the giant Corpse Hound pack was nearly at level 7, it was struggling in the face of so many equally powered Cerberuses. Although they were all Hellhounds, the Cerberuses had a distinct advantage over other types due to their powerful bloodline. The battle situation on the two-headed Hellhounds' side was the same, and they slowly but surely overpowered the giant Corpse Hounds. If things continued as they were, it was only a matter of time before the Cerberus Pack emerged victorious. However, Charles knew that he and his knights couldn't afford the battle to drag out, as there was the danger that they would expend all their soul energy. A giant Corpse Hound leapt in front of him. "A mere level 5 human dares to interfere in our battle!" it roared, and it spat out a ball of dark blue flame. Charles dodged the fireball and lunged toward the giant corpse hound with great speed. A two-headed hellhound also rushed into the fight alongside him.
Does the Cerberus pack really need outsiders to help fight its battles?
The giant corpse hound bellowed, turning to the hounds of the Cerberus pack.
Whatever happened to its previous magnificence?
The Cerberus pack took its reputation very seriously. Although such a slight wouldn't change their battle strategy, it planted a small seed of doubt in their minds. Nevertheless, the two-headed hellhound remained unmoved.
Outsiders?
It growled.
This human is our master's successor. He is no outsider.
At this moment, the giant corpse hound caught sight of Charles, who materialized not far from it.
Where did you come from?
He said in confusion, shocked to see the long sword in Charles's grip.
Is that the Hell Sword?
Charles's eyes flashed with fury as he approached. The giant corpse hound opened its mouth wide and snapped at him, surprisingly agile for all its giant size. If it had caught Charles between its teeth, it would have easily bitten him clean in two. However, just as its jaws closed over its prey, Charles disappeared. The hound screamed, its left eye searing with pain. Two lines of sword energy had formed a cross in front of it before plunging into the eye, half blinding the hound.
Curse you, human!
It roared. It cast about with its paws, trying to strike Charles in its rage, but then it collapsed on the ground. Charles had followed a common method that humans used to deal with large creatures in the apocalyptic era. Making the most of his enemy's blindness, he had chopped off the hound's feet. It collapsed to the ground, giving Charles an opportunity to plunge his blade into its neck.
Damn fleas!
The hound hissed.
I'll get you!
It rolled and struggled to right itself, but this simply gave Charles more opportunities to attack. It caught a glance of Charles with its remaining eye and remained fixed on him. Because of this, it didn't see the two-headed hellhound seize its chance to dash forward and tear out its throat with one set of its teeth. Where their great enemy fell, the nearby hellhounds descended to feast on its body. The balance of the battle had shifted well and truly in favor of the knights and the Cerberus pack.
Human,
said the two-headed hellhound, admiration in its voice.
Thank you for your help.
Its tone made it clear that it deemed Charles truly worthy of his status as the successor to its master. Although he had only recently reached level 5, he had just taken down a level 6 giant corpse hound, emerging completely unscathed. To see a level 5 so grievously injuring a level 6 one only cemented the hound's confidence in him. There will be plenty of opportunities to thank me when the battle is over, said Charles, before throwing himself back into the fight. He ran directly at another level 6 giant corpse hound, which was fighting another two-headed hellhound when it saw Charles approaching. It took a large bite from two-headed hellhound, and then it spat a stream of fire at Charles from its great maw. The flames had the dark blue of hellfire at their heart, but the black around the edges showed that although it couldn't fully control true hellfire, it was able to use a slight amount to strengthen its flame.
Be careful, human,
shouted the two-headed hellhound.
Get out of the way!
It couldn't believe that a level 6 giant corpse hound was capable of such a powerful technique. Although it wouldn't have caused much damage to a member of the Cerberus pack, it could easily take out a human from the mortal world. And as this particular human had already shown his immense value to the Cerberuses, it was desperate to do anything to protect him. Charles didn't dodge. Instead, he raised his hand and summoned an orb of water.
He's done for,
thought the two-headed hellhound in despair, watching Charles show no signs of slowing or stepping out of the way of the true hellfire, which could burn through everything.
How does this human expect to extinguish it with mere water?
The creature wondered. When the fire met the water, the two erupted in a ball of water vapor, extinguishing the true hellfire. The two-headed hellhound's eyes widened in amazement. It only knew of one substance capable of extinguishing true hellfire, and that was true water. The temperature of true water was so low that a single drop of it could turn a pond into ice. What stunned the two-headed hellhound even more was that it had thought only a level 7 water-type warrior could control true water.
Impossible,
it gasped. The giant corpse hound was just as shocked. It hadn't expected anything to be able to block its true hellfire attack. Charles used the cover of the water vapor to steal behind the giant corpse hound, slashing its underbelly with the icy blade of his hell sword. The beast fell to the ground with a crash. Charles climbed up on it, drawing the point of his sword across its exposed chest, and a nearby pack of hellhounds saw their opportunity to pounce on the giant corpse hound. Anthony and the others in the rear of the army were dumbfounded. "Too brutal," he said, shaking his head. Dale nodded. "It's too much," he muttered. Miranda, who had meanwhile been killing her own share of hellish creatures, took a moment to survey the battlefield. Only at that moment did she see what Charles had achieved. Has he really grown so strong already? She wondered. Seeing his great power on the battlefield made her feel a little helpless. She had once thought of the two of them as a team, but watching him deal so skillfully and brutally with the hellhounds made her afraid that he would never really need her at his side. He was able to take down level 6 creatures in a matter of minutes, while she wouldn't even dare enter such a fight. If it came to it, would she ever be any use against an enemy of such a high level? Or would she forever rely on Charles to swoop in and save the day? It doesn't matter, she thought. Either way, I need to become stronger. She plunged her blood-drinking sword into the belly of a nearby level 5 giant corpse hound. The blade was beautiful, glittering in the flame as it felled the hound. It was designed to grow in strength corresponding to the power of its wielder. For example, it would be stronger in the hands of an expert in swordcraft compared to an amateur, even after their skill levels were taken into account. "I have to become stronger," she cried out. She pulled the sword from the hound's body and cast around, looking for the next enemy. "Control your strength," said a familiar voice beside her. She turned to find Elena standing there, looking at the hound's corpse and frowning slightly. Charles had taught Elena the importance of controlling her power and not letting it control her. How exactly one went about doing this, though, she still didn't know. She noticed that some of the giant corpse hounds they were fighting started to run away. After the 2 level 6 giant corpse hounds had fallen, it was clear the tide of the battle was turning. A 2-headed hellhound pounced into a crowd of the giant corpse hounds, tearing them to pieces and stemming their onslaught. Once it was finished with them, it joined 2 others of its kind, and together they turned on some new targets. The giant corpse hound army was soon defeated, its troops collapsing in all directions. When I was fighting, thought Elena, I could only kill a few of these monsters with each strike. But since Charles took care of those level 6 giant corpse hounds, the rest have lost all confidence. Now look at them, falling about all over the place. It's not just that Charles is strong, but that he knows where best to use his strength. She finally understood. If she could learn where best to focus her strength, it would no longer take hold of her, causing her to lose her focus and better judgment in battle. With this realization, she felt her control over her sword energy expand. The fighting was soon over. After Charles had defeated the giant corpse hounds, what had begun as a battle of attrition had turned into a speedy victory for the Knights of Hell and the Cerberus pack. It wasn't a flawless victory, though. Although the Cerberuses were stronger than the giant corpse hounds, they didn't escape the battle completely unscathed, with many sustaining serious injuries. But these were nothing to the Cerberus pack, which had been born to fight. Besides, they knew their wounds would heal soon enough. With the battle over, Charles took the opportunity to use his ancient book to refine the bodies of the level 6 giant corpse hounds. They were his spoils of war, and their energy allowed him to advance into the 3rd stage of level 5. He left the bodies of the rest of the giant corpse hounds for the Cerberus pack to feast on. He knew that his reward for helping them would be far more valuable than the resources offered by their corpses. "How many did we lose?" he asked Helen. Although Mark was the commander of the Knights, Charles knew that he was sensitive and found it difficult to count the casualties. 13 died, said Helen, looking downcast, and many more have been injured. She had been helping the wounded since the conflict had come to an end, bolstering her healing abilities with a large number of crystal cores, but she hadn't been able to save everyone. 13, thought Charles. That's fewer than I expected. He couldn't say this out loud, of course. It would be a bad move as a leader to announce to his followers that he had expected more of them would have died. No matter the high esteem in which they held him, this was a taboo subject that could not be violated. Nevertheless, he had assumed they would lose at least 10% of their forces. but he hadn't accounted for just how well his knights had applied themselves to developing their cultivation methods and preparation. They had been worried that Charles would judge them as weak on the battlefield, and this had driven them to develop their strength far beyond Charles's expectations. The small number of casualties was proof of the work and dedication of his team. The work and dedication demanded by the dangerous and forbidding world they lived in. After sorting through the detritus of the battlefield, Charles helped to cure some of the two-headed hellhounds of their curse effects, allowing them to advance to level 6. Meanwhile, some of the Cerberuses had reached the highest stage of level 7. If Charles had helped to heal the entire Cerberus pack, it would have drawn unwanted attention, but helping just a few of the hounds in this way was safe. After all, the curse would naturally weaken at different rates for each hound, so it wouldn't be so suspicious if a few Cerberuses were seen to be stronger than the other members of the pack. It was easier for Charles to heal the curse than the ordinary hellhounds. After all, the curse's power grew according to the strength of the hound in question. When he had completely removed the curse of one of these hounds, it quickly reached the highest stage of level 5.
"Humans,"
said one of the Cerberuses,
"you have our gratitude. As a reward, we will give you some of our two-headed hellhounds to become your companions in battle. However, you must remember one thing. They are fighting alongside you. They are not your servants."
The Cerberus pack was loyal to those who helped it, but it was important to make clear the exact terms of that loyalty. The Knights of Hell had helped them to reclaim a portion of their territory, which was no small matter. It was important that they were rewarded for their efforts. While the Cerberus pack treated the hounds that hadn't grown a third head as little more than cannon fodder, they were still of the same bloodline, and it was important that Charles and his knights treated them as such. With the permission of the Cerberuses, Charles bestowed on Miranda, Anthony, and the others the power to summon the Cerberus pack when needed. This was most useful to Anthony, who was a powerful dark summoner and could directly contact 9 life forms in his summoning. "It took me a month to learn how to summon level 4 creatures," he said, "and now after one battle, I'm able to summon these level 5 hounds. Thank you so much." Although he preferred to fight in close combat, he was glad about the extra support the hounds would provide. After all, when it came to the thick of battle, it didn't really matter which way he preferred to fight. He would be happy for all the help he could get. Moreover, he had seen the strength of these creatures. They were ferocious in battle and seemed near invincible. Charles patted his shoulder. "Now you're the strongest in the team," he said, "just like I said you would be. Remember that you'll now have the responsibility of protecting us." "Don't worry," Anthony said, bringing his hand to his heart. "No one's dying on my watch." It was clear that the Cerberus pack had its doubts about Anthony's abilities, but Charles didn't care. He was busy making his next arrangements for the Knights of Hell, though not before taking stock of how far they had come. They had fought an entire army of low-level hellish creatures and had lived to tell the tale. They were even starting to adapt to the environment and the hellfire that blazed all around them. The main battle had ended, but their training had to continue. If they were able to display and practice their combat strength in such an inhospitable environment, they would be even stronger when they returned to the mortal world. After the giant corpse hounds had been defeated, the Cerberus pack began to patrol the area to secure their gains. They were gone for some time, but brought back with them some 2-horned horses and nightmare horses. Since the original owner of the territory had already been taken care of, the ownership of the creatures in it fell to the Cerberus pack.
"Take these as your mounts," one of the Cerberuses said. "If you're happy with them, we can capture more for you."
It was clear that its triumphant victory, the retrieval of its territory, and its recovering strength had put the pack in a generous mood.